The gunshot echoed across the valley, sending a flock of startled birds into the pink dawn sky, as Nathaniel Mills cradled her unconscious father in her trembling arms. Blood soaked through her pale blue dress as tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. 3 men on horseback circled around her, their faces hidden beneath bandanas, eyes cold as the barrels of their revolvers. "Please," she begged, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "He needs a doctor." The tallest of the men dismounted, spurs jangling against the hardened earth as he approached. He yanked her to her feet, his grip bruising her arm as he dragged her away from her father's still form. "Your pa's got till sundown tomorrow to surrender the deed to the Double M Ranch," he growled, his breath hot against her cheek. "Or you won't be coming home at all." Arkansas Territory, 1846. The land was bathed in golden light as the sun began its descent behind the rolling hills surrounding Bentonville. Mason Garland guided his horse, a sturdy Palomino named Chance, down the main street, his keen eyes observing the small but growing settlement. At 26, Mason had already made a name for himself as one of the best trackers in the territory. Tall and broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled beneath his wide-brimmed hat, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth. Mason had been away for nearly 3 months, working as a scout for a group of settlers heading west from Missouri. The journey had been long but uneventful, and he was glad to be back in familiar territory. He planned to rest for a few days before setting out again, perhaps heading south toward Texas, where he'd heard rumors of good land for sale. The town seemed oddly quiet for this time of day. A few people hurried along the boardwalks, heads down, conversations hushed. Even the saloon, usually buzzing with activity, appeared subdued. Something was wrong. Mason dismounted in front of the general store, tying Chance to the hitching post before stepping inside. The store owner, Harold Jenkins, looked up from behind the counter, his expression brightening at the sight of the tracker. "Mason Garland, as I live and breathe, didn't expect to see you back so soon." Mason removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Got the settlers safely to their destination ahead of schedule. Thought I'd come back to familiar ground before deciding where to head next." He leaned against the counter. "Town seems quiet. Something happened while I was gone." Harold's face fell, and he glanced toward the door as if checking for eavesdroppers before lowering his voice. "Bad business, real bad. Joseph Mills was shot yesterday morning and his daughter Nathaniel taken." Mason's blood ran cold. He'd known the Mills family for years. Joseph had been one of the first to welcome him to Bentonville when he'd arrived 5 years ago, a young man with little more than his horse and skills. And Nathaniel Nate, as most called her, was a force of nature, as fierce as she was beautiful with her honey gold hair and sharp wit. "Who did it?" Mason demanded, his voice hard. "Raymond Caldwell's men, most likely. Been trying to get his hands on the Mills water rights for years." Harold shook his head. "Sheriff's organized a posse, but they ain't found nothing yet. Mills still alive. Barely. Doc Thompson's with him, but it don't look good." Harold hesitated. "They left a note. Said Mills has till sundown tomorrow to sign over the deed to his ranch, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Mason didn't need him to. He settled his hat back on his head. "Sheriff Carson still keep his office behind the jailhouse?" Harold nodded. "He'll be glad to see you. Always said you could track a ghost through a snowstorm." Mason strode out of the store, his mind already calculating distances and possibilities. The Mills Ranch was about 15 miles north of town. If Caldwell's men had taken Nate, they wouldn't risk keeping her close. They'd head for the hills, perhaps to one of the old mining camps that dotted the Ozarks. Sheriff Carson was a stout man with graying hair and a perpetually worried expression that had deepened into crevices of fear when Mason entered his office. "Mason Garland," he said, rising from behind his desk. "Heard you were back in town. Just arrived." "Harold told me about Mills and his daughter." Carson sighed heavily. "Been out with a posse since yesterday, but the trail went cold at the creek about 5 miles north. They must have ridden through the water to hide their tracks. I need to see where it happened, and I need to know everything about these men. How many, what kind of horses, anything Mills might have said before he lost consciousness." The sheriff rubbed his chin. 3 men, according to Mills. He recognized one as Caldwell's foreman, Tom Blackburn. Mean son of a gun with a scar across his right cheek. Don't know about the others, but they were riding a bay, a roan, and a black horse. He paused. "Mills is conscious but weak. He's at Doc Thompson's place if you want to talk to him yourself." Mason nodded. "I'll do that. Then I'll head out to where they took her. You aiming to go after them alone? I'll move faster that way." Mason's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Besides, tracking's what I do best." The doctor's house was quiet, the curtains drawn against the late afternoon sun. Mason knocked softly, and the door was opened by the doctor's wife, a small woman with kind eyes. "I'm here to see Joseph Mills," Mason said, removing his hat. She nodded, leading him to a back bedroom where the wounded man lay. Joseph Mills had always been robust, a bear of a man with a booming laugh and iron grip. Now he looked shrunken, his skin ashen against the white sheets. "Garland," Mills croaked when he saw him, attempting to raise a hand in greeting. Mason moved to the bedside, taking the older man's hand briefly. "Save your strength, Mr. Mills. I just need to know anything that might help me find Nate." Joseph's eyes, the same warm brown as his daughter's, filled with tears. "Should have seen them coming. They ambushed us on the north pasture. She was with me, checking fences." His voice broke. "My Nate, she tried to fight them. Brave girl. Did you recognize any of them besides Blackburn? One was Caldwell's new hired gun, goes by Russo, don't know the third." Mills struggled to sit up, wincing with the effort. "They're holding her somewhere until I sign over the water rights, but that water feeds half the farms in the valley. Can't let Caldwell control it." "I'll find her," Mason promised, his voice quiet but firm. "You focus on getting better." Mills gripped Mason's wrist with surprising strength. "Bring her home, son. Bring my girl home." The sun was beginning its downward arc when Mason reached the Mills ranch. The foreman, an old cowhand named Pete, met him at the gate, his weathered face grim. "Heard you were back," Pete said. "Come to help find Miss Nate," Mason nodded, dismounting. "Need to see where it happened." Pete led him to a section of fence in the northern pasture. The grass was trampled, and dark stains that could only be blood marked the earth. Mason crouched, examining the ground with a practiced eye. 3 riders approached from the east," he said, pointing to the tracks. "They waited behind those rocks, ambushed Mills and Nate when they rode up." He followed the trail of disturbed earth. "There was a struggle here. Nate didn't go easily." A small, sad smile touched Pete's lips. "Never does. That girl's got more fight in her than most men I know." Mason stood, continuing to read the story written in the dirt. "They headed north after taking her." He glanced at the sky. "I need to move if I'm going to catch them before dark. You going alone?" "I could round up some of the boys, no time," Mason said, already mounting chance. "And I work better alone for this kind of tracking." Pete nodded, understanding. "Godspeed, then. Bring her back safe." Mason rode hard, following the trail north until it reached Beaver Creek, just as the sheriff had said. The water was shallow but swift-moving, perfect for obscuring tracks. Most trackers would have been stymied, forced to search both banks for miles looking for where the riders had exited the water. But Mason wasn't most trackers. He studied the creek bed carefully, noting a slight displacement of pebbles that indicated heavy weight had recently passed. The riders had continued upstream, not across as most would expect. He guided Chance into the water, following the barely perceptible signs for nearly a mile before finding where they'd finally left the creek, climbing up a steep embankment on the eastern shore. The sun was low on the horizon now, casting long shadows through the trees. Mason pushed on, knowing he was losing daylight. The kidnappers had a full day's head start, but they were burdened with a prisoner and likely moving cautiously to avoid notice. As dusk settled over the land, the trail led Mason into increasingly rugged country. The Ozarks rose before him, their forested slopes dark and imposing in the fading light. He knew these hills well, had hunted in them for years. There were old mining camps scattered throughout, abandoned when the silver veins ran dry, perfect places to hide a kidnapped woman. The trail grew fainter as the terrain became rockier, but Mason pressed on until the darkness made tracking impossible. Reluctantly, he made camp in a small clearing, building only the smallest of fires to cook a meager meal of jerky and coffee. As he sat watching the flames, his thoughts turned to Nathaniel Mills. She'd been just 17 when he first came to Bentonville, a spirited girl with a quick smile and quicker temper. Over the years, he'd watched her grow into a formidable young woman of 22, capable of running the ranch as well as any man. There'd been times, during his visits to the Mills ranch, when he'd caught her looking at him with something more than friendship in her eyes. And perhaps, if he were honest with himself, he'd felt something too. But Mason had never stayed in one place long enough to pursue those feelings. His life was on the trail, moving with the seasons and the work. A man like him had no business thinking of a future with a woman like Nathaniel Mills. Now, though, as he prepared to face whatever dangers lay ahead to rescue her, Mason confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. Nate meant more to him than just the daughter of a friend. The thought of her in danger, afraid and alone, made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. He rose before dawn, saddling Chance while the eastern sky was still dark. The trail was cold but clear enough in the growing light. The kidnappers had headed deeper into the hills, just as he'd suspected. By mid-morning, Mason found confirmation of his theory, a set of tracks branching off toward an area known for its abandoned silver mines. The trail grew fresher as he climbed higher into the hills. They were moving slower now, their horses tiring on the steep terrain. Mason pushed Chance harder, knowing he was gaining on them. Around noon, he caught his first glimpse of smoke rising above the trees. A small mining camp nestled in a narrow valley came into view as he crested a ridge. 3 horses were hitched outside a ramshackle cabin, matching the descriptions the sheriff had given. A bay, a roan, and a black. Mason dismounted, tethering Chance well back from the ridge. He checked his Colt revolvers, making sure they were loaded and ready. Then he studied the layout of the camp, planning his approach. The cabin sat at the center of the clearing, with an old mine entrance visible on the hillside behind it. A small corral held the horses, and a second, smaller structure, probably a storehouse or tool shed, stood off to one side. No one was visible outside, but smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, suggesting at least one person was inside. Mason worked his way down the ridge, using the cover of trees and rocks to approach unseen. He needed to determine how many men were in the camp and, more importantly, where they were keeping Nate. As he edged closer, he heard voices from inside the cabin. 2 men arguing, their words indistinct but their tone clear. Mason crept around to the back, finding a small window partially covered with an old burlap sack. Carefully, he peered inside. Two men sat at a rough-hewn table, playing cards. One was unmistakably Tom Blackburn, the scar on his cheek vivid even in the dim light. The other was younger, with a thin face and nervous hands, likely the hired gun Mills had mentioned, Russo. But there was no sign of Nate or the third kidnapper. Mason continued his circuit of the cabin, looking for another entrance or a cellar where they might be holding her. Finding nothing, he turned his attention to the smaller building across the clearing. It was risky to cross the open ground, but he needed to know if Nate was there. He waited until both men inside the cabin seemed engrossed in their card game, then darted across to the smaller structure. It was a simple shed with a padlocked door. Mason pressed his ear against the rough wood and heard movement inside, followed by a muffled sound that might have been a voice. "Nate," he whispered, lips close to the door. "It's Mason Garland. Are you in there?" Silence, then a shuffling sound. "Mason," the voice was hoarse but unmistakably hers. "Is that really you?" Relief flooded through him. "Yes. Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious. But they've got me tied up and there's a guard." The door to the cabin slammed open, cutting off her warning. Mason pressed himself against the wall of the shed as the third kidnapper emerged from the cabin, heading toward his position. "Checking on our guest, Jake," called Blackburn from the doorway. The man called Jake grunted in response. "Just making sure she's still secure. Caldwell wants her unharmed when Mills signs over the deed." Mason drew his revolver, waiting as Jake approached. The man was big, with a shaggy beard and heavy brow. He pulled a key from his pocket as he reached the shed. Mason struck as the key entered the lock, bringing the butt of his revolver down hard on the back of Jake's head. The man crumpled without a sound. Quickly, Mason dragged the unconscious body around the corner of the shed, out of sight from the cabin. He took the keys, unlocked the door, and slipped inside. The interior was dark and musty, lit only by what little sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls. Nathaniel sat against the far wall, her wrists and ankles bound with rope, a gag tied around her mouth. Her honey gold hair was disheveled, and a bruise darkened one cheekbone, but her eyes, those familiar brown eyes, blazed with fierce determination. Mason rushed to her side, removing the gag and starting work on the ropes binding her wrists. "I knew someone would come," she whispered, her voice rough from thirst, "but I didn't expect it to be you." "Just happened to ride into town at the right time," he said, slicing through the ropes with his knife. "Your father's alive, by the way, wounded, but the doc thinks he'll recover." Relief softened her features. "Thank God. They told me he was dead." As the ropes fell away, Nate rubbed her wrists, wincing. Mason moved to cut the bindings around her ankles. "We need to move quickly," he said, helping her to her feet. "There are still two men in the cabin." Nate swayed slightly and Mason caught her arm to steady her. "Sorry," she murmured. "Been tied up for nearly a day. Legs are a bit numb." "Can you walk?" She straightened, setting her jaw. "I can run if I have to." That was the Nate he knew. Mason smiled despite the danger. "Good. My horse is up on the ridge. We'll head there, circle around to avoid the cabin." They slipped out of the shed, Nate moving more steadily with each step. Mason led her toward the trees at the edge of the clearing, keeping the shed between them and the cabin. They were halfway to cover when a shout rang out from the cabin. Blackburn stood in the doorway, pointing in their direction. "The girl's escaping. Russo, get out here." Mason pushed Nate toward the trees. "Run," he commanded, drawing both revolvers as he turned to face the kidnappers. Blackburn was already advancing, gun drawn. Russo appeared in the doorway behind him, fumbling for his weapon. Mason fired twice in quick succession. His first shot caught Blackburn in the shoulder, spinning the man around. The second missed Russo, who dove back into the cabin for cover. Nate had reached the tree line. Mason backed toward her, keeping his weapons trained on the cabin. Blackburn writhed on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder, while Russo fired wildly from the cabin window. Mason returned fire, forcing Russo to duck back inside. Then he turned and ran for the trees, joining Nate in the cover of the forest. "This way," he said, leading her up the ridge toward where he'd left Chance. They moved as quickly as possible through the underbrush, Nate keeping pace despite her ordeal. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. Russo had recovered from his initial panic and was giving chase, following their trail through the forest. "He's gaining on us," Nate gasped as they climbed the steep slope, "and there's only one horse." "Chance can carry us both," Mason assured her. "We just need to reach him." They crested the ridge and Mason's heart sank. Chance was where he'd left him, but the Palomino was not alone. Jake had regained consciousness and found the horse. He stood beside Chance, gun drawn, waiting for them. Mason pushed Nate behind a large boulder, taking cover as Jake fired in their direction. The bullet ricocheted off the rock, sending fragments flying. "We're trapped between them," Nate said, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. Mason assessed their situation. Jake was above them with Chance, while Russo was climbing the ridge from below. Blackburn was wounded but still potentially a threat if he recovered enough to join the pursuit. "We need to split them up," Mason decided. "I'm going to circle around, try to get behind Jake." "You stay here, keep out of sight." Nate's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "No, I'm not sitting here helpless while you risk your life. Give me one of your guns." Mason hesitated, then handed her his second revolver. "You know how to use this." A grim smile touched her lips. "Pa taught me to shoot when I was 12. Of course he had. Joseph Mills wouldn't raise a daughter who couldn't defend herself." Mason nodded. "All right. When I give the signal, fire a couple of shots at Jake, aim high, just to distract him. I'll work my way around and take him by surprise." Nate nodded, checking the revolver with practiced hands. Mason was struck by her composure. Most women, most men, for that matter, would be falling apart after what she'd endured. But not Nathaniel Mills. Mason crept away, using the boulders and trees for cover as he circled around Jake's position. Below, he could hear Russo crashing through the underbrush, still climbing toward them. When he was in position, Mason whistled a high, sharp sound that carried across the ridge. Immediately, Nate fired twice from her hiding place. Jake swung around, returning fire in her direction. Mason charged, tackling Jake from behind. They went down hard, Jake's gun flying from his hand. The big man was strong, rolling over and landing a solid blow to Mason's jaw. Stars exploded in his vision, but he recovered quickly, driving his fist into Jake's midsection. They grappled in the dirt, each fighting for advantage. Jake was heavier, using his weight to pin Mason down. His hands found Mason's throat, squeezing with brutal force. Mason's vision began to darken at the edges. He clawed at Jake's hands, trying to break the grip that was crushing his windpipe. Then, suddenly, Jake's weight was gone. Nate stood above them, Mason's revolver gripped in both hands. She'd struck Jake from behind with the butt of the weapon, and the man lay stunned beside Mason. "Get up," she ordered, keeping the gun trained on Jake. "We need to move before Russo gets here." Mason scrambled to his feet, retrieving Jake's discarded weapon. Without hesitation, he clubbed the dazed man unconscious, then quickly bound his hands and feet with the man's own belt and bandana. "Get on, Chance," he told Nate, helping her into the saddle before mounting behind her. "Hold on tight." She leaned back against his chest as he urged the horse forward, away from the ridge. Russo's shouts grew louder as they rode off, but Mason knew they had the advantage now. With a fresh horse and a good head start, they could easily outpace the remaining kidnapper. They rode hard for several miles, putting distance between themselves and the mining camp. When Mason was confident they weren't being pursued, he slowed Chance to a more sustainable pace. "How did you find me?" Nate asked, her voice carrying over the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. "Tracking's what I do," Mason replied, "and I know these hills. There aren't many places to hide a kidnapped woman." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for coming after me. Your father asked me to bring you home. I gave my word." "Is that the only reason?" The question hung in the air between them. Mason was acutely aware of her warmth against his chest, the scent of her hair despite the dust and dirt of captivity. For years, he'd kept his feelings carefully contained, telling himself that a wanderer like him had no right to care for someone like her. But facing the prospect of losing her had changed something fundamental within him. "No," he admitted finally, "that's not the only reason." She didn't respond, but he felt her relax against him, her hand finding his where it held the reins. They rode through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest Chance and drink from a clear stream. Nate washed the dirt from her face, the cool water revealing the true extent of the bruise on her cheek. Mason felt anger surge through him at the sight, wishing he'd done more than knock Jake unconscious. "We should reach Bentonville by nightfall," he said as they remounted. "Your father will be relieved to see you safe." Nate nodded, but her expression grew troubled. "What about Caldwell?" "He still wants our water rights. This won't be the end of it. First things first, let's get you home, then we'll deal with Caldwell." The sun was setting as they rode into Bentonville, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. People stopped and stared as they passed, whispers following in their wake. By the time they reached the doctor's house, a small crowd had gathered. Mason helped Nate dismount, supporting her as her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. The doctor's wife hurried out to meet them, embracing Nate with tears in her eyes. "Your father's been beside himself with worry," she said, leading Nate inside. "He's weak, but he's been asking for you every hour." Mason followed them into the house, hanging back as Nate was reunited with her father. Joseph Mills wept openly as he held his daughter, his large frame shaking with sobs of relief. Mason felt like an intruder on their private moment and turned to leave. "Garland," Mills called, stopping him. "Come here, son." Mason approached the bed, uncomfortable with the naked gratitude in the older man's eyes. "You brought her back just like you promised," Mills said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks. I'm just glad I got to her in time." Nate looked up at him, her brown eyes soft in the lamplight. "Father, Mason killed one of the kidnappers and wounded Blackburn. He saved my life." Mills nodded gravely. "Caldwell won't take this lying down. When he hears his men failed, he'll try something else." "Then we need to deal with Caldwell directly," Mason said. "End this once and for all." "How?" Nate asked. "He's got money influence. The sheriff's been trying to pin something on him for years." Mason considered this. "We need proof. Something that connects him directly to the kidnapping and attempted murder. If we could get one of his men to talk." Mills began, but trailed off, shaking his head. "Blackburn's too loyal, been with Caldwell for years." "What about the hired gun, Russo?" Mason suggested. He seemed nervous, less committed, and he's newer to Caldwell's outfit. "It's worth a try," Mills agreed. "But how do we get to him?" The doctor interrupted their planning, insisting that both Mills and Nate needed rest. Mason reluctantly took his leave, promising to return in the morning. The sheriff was waiting outside, eager for details of the rescue. Mason gave him a brief account, emphasizing the need to deal with Caldwell before he tried again. "I've wanted to bring that snake down for years," Carson admitted, "but he's careful. Never leaves evidence that could tie him to anything illegal." "Then we create a situation where he has to reveal himself," Mason said. a plan beginning to form in his mind. He spent the night in the town's small hotel, rising early to check on Chance before returning to the doctor's house. Nate was already up, dressed in fresh clothes someone had brought from the ranch. The bruise on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she told him as they sat on the doctor's porch. "About creating a situation to trap Caldwell. And what if we let him think his plan worked, that my father is going to sign over the water rights?" Mason considered this. "Go on. We arrange the meeting, make him think he's won. But we bring the sheriff and enough witnesses to ensure he can't just shoot Pa and take the deed anyway." "It's risky," Mason said. "Caldwell's desperate. He might not play by the rules even with witnesses present. That's why we need to bait the trap properly." Nate leaned forward, her expression intense. "We tell Caldwell that Pa's agreed to the deal but insists on Caldwell admitting to the kidnapping. Make it a point of pride Pa won't deal with a man who won't own up to his actions. Caldwell's arrogant enough to admit it if he thinks he's won," Mason agreed slowly. "But we'd need to make sure the sheriff and other witnesses are hidden until the confession's made." "Exactly." Nate's eyes sparkled with determination. "And once he confesses, the sheriff arrests him, and we keep our water rights." It was a bold plan, with plenty of ways it could go wrong, but it might be their best chance to end Caldwell's threat permanently. They presented the idea to Joseph Mills, who was sitting up in bed looking markedly improved from the previous day. "It's dangerous," he said after hearing them out. "If Caldwell suspects a trap, he'll come in shooting." "Which is why Mason and I will be armed and ready," Nate insisted. "And the sheriff and his deputies will be nearby." Mills looked at his daughter, a complex mixture of pride and concern in his eyes. "When did you get to be so fearless, Nate? I learned from you, Pa." She took his hand. "We can end this. Today." After further discussion and refinement of the plan, Mills finally agreed. The sheriff was brought into their confidence, and a message was sent to Caldwell proposing a meeting at the Mills ranch that afternoon. The reply came swiftly. Caldwell would come with 2 men no more at 3 o'clock. The next few hours were a flurry of preparation. Nate returned to the ranch with Mason to make arrangements, while the sheriff gathered his most trusted deputies. They planned to hide in the barn and root cellar, close enough to hear Caldwell's confession but out of sight until the moment of arrest. As 3 o'clock approached, Mason found Nate on the porch of the ranch house, watching the road with her father's rifle across her lap. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, sitting beside her. "It's not too late to change the plan." She shook her head. "I'm sure. I'm tired of men like Caldwell thinking they can take whatever they want through violence and intimidation." She turned to look at him. "Aren't you the one who's always telling me that some things are worth fighting for?" Mason smiled. "I don't remember saying that specifically, but it sounds like something I might say." "Well, you've lived by it, always fighting for what's right, helping people who need it." Her gaze softened. "It's one of the things I've always admired about you." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Raymond Caldwell rode at the front, a tall man with silver at his temples and cold eyes that missed nothing. Behind him came Tom Blackburn, his arm in a sling from Mason's bullet, and a thin man Mason recognized as Russo. Nate stood, setting the rifle aside as they'd agreed. No visible weapons, nothing to make Caldwell suspicious until he'd incriminated himself. "Miss Mills," Caldwell called as he dismounted. "I was pleased to receive your father's message. I trust he's recovering well." "Well enough to sign over the deed," Nate replied, her voice cool. "He's inside, resting." Caldwell smiled, a predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Then let's not keep him waiting." Mason stepped forward. "Mr. Caldwell, before we go in, there's something you should know. Joseph has a condition for this transfer." Caldwell's eyebrows rose. "A condition? I was under the impression this was a simple exchange the deed for his daughter's safety, which, I must point out, seems to have become a moot point." His gaze flickered to Nate. "My safety's been secured, thanks to Mason," Nate said. "But Pa still wants to make the deal. He just wants you to admit in front of witnesses that you ordered my kidnapping." A flash of suspicion crossed Caldwell's face. "That's an odd request." "It's a matter of pride," Mason explained. "Joseph says he can accept losing to a man who's brave enough to own his actions. But he won't sign over his life's work to a coward who hides behind hired guns." It was a calculated insult, designed to appeal to Caldwell's vanity and arrogance. For a long moment the rancher stared at them, clearly weighing his options. "And who would these witnesses be?" he finally asked. "Just the three of us," Nate said. "And Pa, of course." Caldwell looked at Blackburn, who gave a slight nod. Apparently reassured that they could handle any trouble from Mason and Nate, Caldwell made his decision. "Very well. If it will expedite matters, I'm willing to acknowledge my role in recent events." Nate led the way inside, where Joseph Mills sat in a chair by the fireplace, a blanket over his legs despite the warm day. He looked up as they entered, his face impassive. "Caldwell," he greeted coldly. "Mills." Caldwell took a seat opposite him. "Your daughter tells me you have a condition before signing over the water rights." Mills nodded slowly. "I do. I want to hear you admit that you ordered my daughter kidnapped and tried to have me killed. No hiding behind these dogs of yours." He gestured to Blackburn and Russo. Caldwell smiled thinly. "Direct as always. Very well. Yes, I ordered the kidnapping. Your stubborn refusal to sell left me little choice. The water that flows through your property is essential for the expansion of my cattle operation. And my shooting, was that your idea too?" "A regrettable necessity." Blackburn got overzealous in his approach. Mason watched as Caldwell casually admitted to attempted murder and kidnapping, seemingly confident in his ability to leave this room unscathed. The rancher truly believed that with Joseph wounded and only Mason and Nate as opposition, he held all the cards. "That's all I needed to hear," Mills said, reaching for the folded document on the table beside him. But instead of handing it to Caldwell, he called out, "Sheriff, did you get that?" The door to the root cellar burst open, and Sheriff Carson emerged, followed by two deputies. Simultaneously, the front door opened to reveal two more lawmen, their weapons drawn, Caldwell's face contorted with rage as he realized the trap. He lunged for his gun, but Mason was faster, drawing his Colt and pressing it against the rancher's chest. "I wouldn't," he advised quietly. Blackburn made a move toward his own weapon, but froze when one of the deputies cocked his shotgun. Russo, surprising no one, immediately raised his hands in surrender. "Raymond Caldwell, you're under arrest for kidnapping and attempted murder," Sheriff Carson announced, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Tom Blackburn, you too." As the sheriff read out the charges, Mason watched Caldwell's facade of civilized rancher crumble, revealing the ruthless criminal beneath. The man spat curses and threats, promising retribution even as he was led away in chains. Nate moved to stand beside her father, who reached up to take her hand. Relief was evident on both their faces as they watched their tormentor being taken away. "It's over," Mills said softly. "Finally over." But Mason wasn't so sure. Men like Caldwell had resources, connections. The courts in frontier territories were notoriously susceptible to bribery and influence. "What about Russo?" he asked the sheriff. "Will he testify against Caldwell?" "Already agreed to it," Carson confirmed. "Says he was just hired for a job, and didn't know it would involve shooting or kidnapping. Whether that's true or not, he's willing to give us details on all of Caldwell's illegal activities in exchange for leniency. That was something, at least. With Russo's testimony and the confession they'd all witnessed, Caldwell might actually face justice. As the law officers departed with their prisoners, a sense of quiet settled over the ranch house. Pete and the other hands, who'd been stationed around the property as additional security, came in to check on their employer. "It went just like you planned, Miss Nate," Pete said admiringly. "Caldwell never suspected a thing." Nate smiled, but Mason could see the exhaustion behind it. The last 2 days had taken a toll on her, physically and emotionally. Now that the danger was past, the strain was beginning to show. "You should rest," he told her quietly. "It's been a long day." She nodded, squeezing her father's shoulder before heading toward her room. At the doorway, she paused, looking back at Mason. "Will you be here when I wake up?" she asked, an unusual vulnerability in her voice. Mason hesitated. His instinct, honed by years of solitary wandering, was to move on now that the crisis was resolved. There would be work elsewhere, trails to follow, new horizons to explore. But as he looked at Nate, something shifted inside him. The thought of riding away, of not seeing her tomorrow and all the tomorrows after, suddenly seemed unbearable. "Yes," he said, "I'll be here." The smile she gave him before disappearing into her room stayed with him as he helped settle Mills into his own bed, then joined Pete and the other hands for a well-deserved meal. Later, Mason sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson. The events of the past days played through his mind: the tracking, the rescue, the trap they'd set for Caldwell. Through it all, Nate had shown courage and quick thinking that matched any man he'd ever known. He heard the door open behind him and turned to see her step onto the porch. She'd changed into a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. The bruise on her cheek was beginning to fade, the colors shifting from angry purple to softer hues. "Mind some company?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Not at all." She settled beside him, drawing her shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "I've been thinking," she said finally. "About what happens next." Mason glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Caldwell's in jail, but his trial won't be for months. Even with Russo's testimony, there's no guarantee he'll be convicted." "You're worried he'll come after you again?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. I'm worried that if I spend all my time looking over my shoulder for threats, I'll miss out on actually living." She turned to face him fully. "When those men took me when I thought I might die, I realized how many things I've left unsaid, how many chances I've let slip by." Mason felt a tightness in his chest, a mingling of hope and fear. "What kind of chances?" "Chances to tell people how I feel, to be honest about what I want." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "To tell a certain tracker that I've been half in love with him since I was 17, and fully in love with him for the past 3 years." The words hung in the evening air between them. Mason found himself speechless, a rare occurrence for a man who prided himself on always knowing the right thing to say. "I know you don't stay in one place long," Nate continued when he didn't immediately respond. "I know the trail calls to you, and I'd never ask you to be someone you're not. But I thought you should know before you ride off again that someone here would miss you. That someone here loves you." Mason reached out, taking her hand in his. It was small but strong, calloused from ranch work, so different from the soft hands of town women. "I've told myself for years that a man like me has no business thinking about a future with anyone," he said slowly. "That the life I lead doesn't have room for attachments. But when I heard you'd been taken, when I thought I might lose you before I ever had the chance to." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "To what?" she prompted gently. "To tell you that you're the reason I keep coming back to Bentonville, that no matter how far I roam, I always find myself thinking about a certain ranch and the remarkable woman who runs it." A smile bloomed across her face, brightening her eyes. "Are you saying you love me too, Mason Garland?" He laughed softly. "I'm saying I think I have for a long time. I just didn't know what to call it until I nearly lost you." She moved closer, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. "And now that you know," in answer, Mason leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Nate responded with a passion that matched his own. Her lips were soft, her skin warm beneath his fingertips as he cradled her face. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not sure what happens next," he admitted. "I only know I don't want to leave." "Then don't." Her reply was simple, direct. "Stay, help us run the ranch. There's more than enough work, and Pa's always said you have a good head for business." The offer was tempting more than tempting, but Mason had spent his adult life answering to no one, following his own path. Could he really settle in one place, even for someone he loved? As if reading his doubts, Nate continued, "It doesn't have to be forever, not right away. Stay through the winter at least, see how it feels." A hint of mischief entered her smile. "Consider it a tracking job, following the trail of whatever this is between us, seeing where it leads." Put that way, it didn't sound like an ending at all, but the beginning of a new adventure. Mason found himself smiling back. "I think I'd like that," he said. "Though your father might have something to say about it." Nate laughed. "Pa's been trying to get you to stay for years. He'll probably start planning the wedding the minute you agree to take the job." "Wedding?" Mason raised an eyebrow, enjoying the blush that spread across her cheeks. "Figure of speech," she said quickly. "Although," she looked at him through her lashes, "would that be such a terrible idea?" "Eventually, I mean." Mason pretended to consider it. "I suppose I could think of worse fates than being married to the bravest, most beautiful woman in the Arkansas Territory." Her blush deepened, but she matched his teasing tone. "And I suppose I could do worse than a legendary tracker who rescued me from kidnappers." "Then it's settled," Mason said, pulling her close again. "I'll stay through the winter, and after that, well, we'll follow the trail together wherever it leads." As he kissed her again, Mason felt something settle inside him, a restlessness he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. For years, he'd thought freedom meant always moving, never putting down roots. Now, holding Nathaniel Mills in his arms, he understood that true freedom came from finding where you belonged and who you belonged with. Spring, 1847, the Double M Ranch bloomed under the April sun. Fields green with new growth and fruit trees heavy with blossoms. Mason stood on the porch of the main house, watching as Nate rode in from checking the north pasture. 6 months had passed since he'd agreed to stay through the winter, and winter had given way to spring without any mention of his departure. Joseph Mills, fully recovered from his wounds, had officially made Mason a partner in the ranch 3 months ago. "This place is too much for one man to run," he'd said. "Even with Nate's help, and since you two are clearly heading toward the altar, might as well make it official on paper." Mason smiled at the memory. Joseph had been right about his daughter's feelings and about Mason's own heart. What had begun as a rescue had blossomed into something neither of them had expected but both had secretly wanted for years. Nate dismounted, handing the reins to one of the hands before joining Mason on the porch. Her cheeks were flushed from the ride, her honey gold hair escaping from its practical braid. "The north fence is holding well," she reported, then smiled as she noticed his expression. "What are you looking at me like that for?" "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he replied honestly. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have believed I could be this content staying in one place. She stepped closer, resting her hands on his chest. Having second thoughts about that proposal. Mason had asked her to marry him at Christmas, presenting her with a simple gold ring he'd purchased on a trip to Fort Smith. The wedding was set for next month, a fact that filled him with equal parts anticipation and nervousness. "Not a single one," he assured her, bending to kiss her lightly. "Though I'm not sure how good I'll be at being a husband." "You'll learn," she said confidently. "Just like you learned to be a rancher." That made him laugh. "I'm still learning that. Your father had to stop me from buying those sickly cattle at the auction last week." "You're getting better," she insisted. "And anyway, I didn't fall in love with you for your ranching skills." "No, what was it then? My rugged good looks, my charming personality?" Nate pretended to consider the question seriously. "I think it was the way you tracked down 3 kidnappers and rescued me before dawn. Very impressive." "I was motivated," Mason said, his tone shifting from teasing to serious. "The thought of losing you before I'd ever had the courage to tell you how I felt. It was unbearable." She rose on her tiptoes to kiss him properly, her arms winding around his neck. Mason held her close, still sometimes amazed that this remarkable woman had chosen him. The sound of a throat clearing broke them apart. Joseph stood in the doorway, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "If you two can stop mooning over each other for 5 minutes, we've got visitors," he announced. "Sheriff Carson's here with news about Caldwell." They followed Joseph inside, where Sheriff Carson waited in the sitting room, hat in his hands. "Miss Mills, Mr. Garland," he greeted them. "Thought you'd want to hear this directly from me. Raymond Caldwell was convicted yesterday in Fort Smith. 20 years for kidnapping, attempted murder, and various other crimes Russo testified about." Relief washed over Nate's face. "So it's really over." "Looks that way," Carson confirmed. Russo got a reduced sentence for his testimony. Blackburn got 15 years. Neither of them is likely to come looking for revenge when they get out. "And Caldwell?" Mason asked. "He'll be an old man by the time he's released, if he lives that long. Prison's hard on men used to power and comfort." The sheriff replaced his hat. "Thought you'd all sleep easier knowing justice was served." After Carson departed, Joseph poured them each a small glass of whiskey to celebrate the news. "To justice," he toasted, raising his glass. "To new beginnings," Nate added. Mason lifted his own glass, looking at the 2 people who had become his family. "To home," he said simply. Later that evening, as the sun set over the hills, Mason and Nate walked along the creek that ran through the Mills property. The water that Raymond Caldwell had coveted so desperately gurgled peacefully over smooth stones, reflecting the golden light of dusk. "I got a letter from my mother today," Nate said as they stopped to watch a pair of deer drinking downstream. "She's definitely coming for the wedding. Said she wouldn't miss it for the world." Elizabeth Mills had moved to St. Louis after her husband's death 5 years ago, preferring city life to the rough frontier. She visited occasionally, but had never tried to persuade Nate to join her in Missouri. "I'm glad," Mason said. "Family should be together for moments like that." Nate glanced up at him. "Do you ever think about trying to find your family? Your real family, I mean." Mason had been orphaned young, raised in a series of foster homes before striking out on his own at 16. He told Nate his story one quiet winter evening, sitting by the fire as snow fell outside. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've made peace with that part of my past, and anyway," he smiled down at her, "I've found my family now." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Just think, a month from now we'll be husband and wife." "Mrs. Nathaniel Garland," he mused. "Has a nice ring to it," she laughed. I'm still keeping Mills for the ranch. Double M has too much history to change it now. Fair enough. As long as you're mine, you can call yourself whatever you want. They stood in comfortable silence as the light faded and stars began to appear. Mason thought about the journey that had brought him here, the years of wandering, the chance arrival in Bentonville just when Nate needed him most, the trap they'd set for Caldwell that had led to justice. Some might call it coincidence. Mason preferred to think of it as destiny. "What are you thinking about?" Nate asked, noticing his contemplative mood. "About tracking," he replied. "About how sometimes the trail you follow leads you exactly where you're meant to be, even if you didn't know that's where you were heading." She smiled, understanding. "And has your trail led you where you want to be?" Mason turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. In the gathering dusk, her eyes were bright with love and promise, reflecting the future they would build together. "It's led me home," he said simply. "And that's all I ever really wanted." May 15, 1847, the day dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for a wedding. Mason stood in the small room at the back of Bentonville's church, adjusting his new suit as nerves battled with excitement in his stomach. "Stop fidgeting," Joseph advised, straightening Mason's tie. "You look fine." "I've never worn anything this formal in my life," Mason complained, though the suit was modest by any standard. Joseph chuckled. "Wait until you see my daughter. Then you'll forget all about how uncomfortable your collar is." The church was filled with people from town and neighboring ranches, all gathered to witness the union of Nathaniel Mills and Mason Garland. Word of their romance, how Mason had tracked down Nate's kidnappers and brought her safely home before dawn, had spread throughout the region, taking on the quality of legend. As Mason took his place at the altar, he scanned the crowded pews. Elizabeth Mills sat in the front row, elegant in a green dress that matched her daughter's eyes. Pete and the other ranch hands occupied an entire row, scrubbed clean and uncomfortable in their Sunday best. Sheriff Carson and his wife sat nearby, along with Dr. Thompson and what seemed like half the population of Bentonville. The small church organ began to play, and all heads turned toward the door. Mason's breath caught in his throat as Nathaniel appeared on her father's arm. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her honey gold hair was arranged in soft curls, crowned with a circlet of spring flowers. But it was her face that captivated Mason, radiant with happiness, her brown eyes finding his immediately across the crowded church. As Joseph led his daughter down the aisle, Mason felt a sense of wonder that this remarkable woman had chosen him. Nate, who could have had her pick of suitors, who ran her father's ranch with skill and determination, who had faced kidnappers with courage, this woman was about to become his wife. When she reached him, Joseph placed her hand in Mason's with a smile that held both blessing and warning. Then Nate was beside him, and the minister was speaking the ancient words that would bind them together. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Mason heard the words as if from a distance, his focus entirely on the woman beside him. They had written their own vows, and when the time came, he took both her hands in his. "Nathaniel Mills," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Before I met you, I thought freedom meant never staying in one place, never putting down roots. You taught me that true freedom comes from finding where you belong and who you belong with." He squeezed her hands gently. "I belong with you. I promise to be your partner in all things, to face whatever trails life leads us down together, and to love you with all that I am for all the days of my life." Tears shimmered in Nate's eyes, but her voice was clear and strong as she spoke her own vows. "Mason Garland, you came into my life like a storm, unexpected and powerful, changing everything in your wake. You found me when I was lost, brought me home when I thought all hope was gone." Her smile brightened. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to make a home with you wherever life takes us, and to love you with all that I am for all the days of my life." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that symbolized promises more precious than any material wealth. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed his bride to the cheers and applause of everyone present. The celebration afterward was held at the Double M Ranch, with tables set up under the trees and lanterns hung to light the festivities as day turned to dusk. There was music and dancing, food and drink in abundance. Joseph had spared no expense for his only daughter's wedding. As the evening progressed, Mason found himself watching Nate as she danced with her father, her face alight with joy. Elizabeth Mills approached, offering him a glass of champagne. "She looks happy," Nate's mother observed, following his gaze. "I hope to keep her that way," Mason replied honestly. Elizabeth studied him with shrewd eyes. "When Joseph wrote to tell me his daughter was marrying a tracker who'd rescued her from kidnappers, I had my doubts. But seeing you together," she smiled. "Well, it's clear she made the right choice." Later, as the celebration continued around them, Mason led Nate away from the lights and music, down to the creek where he'd proposed 5 months earlier. "Happy, Mrs. Garland?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Deliriously so, Mr. Garland." She leaned against him with a contented sigh. "Though I'm looking forward to when all these people go home and we can start our life together properly." Mason laughed. "Your father mentioned something about a wedding present, said he'd show us tomorrow. Any idea what it is?" "None, though he's been looking mighty pleased with himself lately." The mystery was solved the following morning when Joseph led them to a clearing about a quarter-mile from the main house, where a brand-new cabin stood, smoke already rising from its chimney. "Figured you two would want your own place," Joseph explained as they stared in surprise. "Close enough to help with the ranch, but far enough for privacy." Nate hugged her father, tears in her eyes. "It's perfect, Pa. When did you have time to build this?" "Had the hands working on it all winter while Mason was learning the cattle business," Joseph said with a wink. "Pete supervised. There's furniture inside, and Elizabeth sent some things from St. Louis for the kitchen." The cabin was modest but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room centered around a stone fireplace. Windows looked out over the creek and the rolling pastures beyond. It was, Mason realized, the perfect blend of civilization and wilderness, just like the life he and Nate were building together. That evening, as they sat on their own porch watching the sunset, Nate leaned against Mason's shoulder with a contented sigh. "Did you ever imagine when you were tracking those kidnappers that you'd end up here?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "Never. But I've learned that life's trails lead to unexpected places." He kissed the top of her head, "And I couldn't be happier about where this one led me." May 1857, the Double M Ranch had prospered in the decade since Mason and Nate's wedding. The original property had expanded, additional hands had been hired, and their reputation for quality cattle spread throughout the region. Joseph Mills had gradually stepped back from day-to-day operations, content to watch his daughter and son-in-law run the business he'd built. But the greatest joy of those 10 years ran across the yard now, a boy of 8 with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit, followed by his 6-year-old sister, whose golden curls bounced as she chased after her brother. James. Sarah, not so close to the corral. Nate called from the porch, where she sat shelling peas with her father. The children adjusted their course, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Mason watched from the barn doorway, pride and love swelling in his chest. These 2 miracles, along with their mother, were the center of his world. Joseph chuckled as he watched his grandchildren play. That boy's going to be a tracker like his father. Caught him halfway to the creek yesterday, said he was following deer tracks. Sarah's the one you need to watch, Mason replied, joining them on the porch. Found her in the barn last week trying to saddle her pony by herself. Said she was going to ride to town to buy candy. Nate laughed. I can't imagine where she gets such ideas. The look she gave Mason was filled with warm memories of their own adventures over the years. At 65, Joseph was still robust, though his hair had gone completely white and he walked with a slight limp from an old injury. He spent most of his days on the porch or in his study, but his mind remained sharp, and his advice on ranch matters was still sought and valued. Mail came, Mason said, handing Nate several letters. One from your mother. Elizabeth visited annually, doting on her grandchildren and filling the house with stories of St. Louis society. Though she never said it aloud, Mason suspected she was proud of the life her daughter had built here in Arkansas. She's planning her summer visit, Nate confirmed after reading the letter. Says she's bringing new books for the children and a surprise for Pa. Joseph's eyes twinkled. That woman and her surprises. Last time it was that fancy chair that's too uncomfortable to sit in for more than 10 minutes. As the afternoon waned, Mason and Nate walked together to their cabin, which had expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. The children ran ahead, eager to help Sarah's kitten, which had apparently gotten itself stuck in a tree again. 10 years, Nate mused as they walked hand in hand. Sometimes it feels like our wedding was yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together. Mason squeezed her hand. Best 10 years of my life, though I still haven't quite figured out how to be a rancher. That made her laugh. You're the one who negotiated that contract with the Army last year. I'd say you've figured out more than you think. They reached the cabin to find James already halfway up the oak tree where the kitten was perched, Sarah directing operations from below. Be careful. Nate called, her maternal instinct warring with her belief in letting the children learn through experience. Mason watched as his son carefully made his way to the stranded kitten, showing the same patience and determination that had served Mason well as a tracker. The boy's movements were deliberate, his focus complete. When he successfully retrieved the kitten and made his way back down, Mason felt a surge of pride. Well done, son, he said, ruffling James's hair as the boy handed the kitten to his delighted sister. It was easy, James replied with casual confidence. Just had to find the right path up. Mason exchanged a smile with Nate. Their son might not realize it, but he just articulated one of life's most important lessons. That night, after the children were asleep, Mason and Nate sat on their porch, a habit they'd maintained through all the years of their marriage. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the dark canvas of the sky. I got a letter today too, Mason said, breaking the comfortable silence. From an old friend in Colorado Territory. Says there's opportunity there for experienced ranchers. Nate turned to look at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Are you thinking of going? Mason shook his head. Not for myself, but I thought maybe someday when James is older he might want to make his own way. It's good to know where the opportunities are. She relaxed against him. For a moment I thought you might be getting restless. Not restless, he assured her. Just thinking about the future. About the trails our children might follow. Nate was quiet for a moment, then said, Do you ever miss it? The tracking, the open trail, the freedom to go wherever the wind takes you. It was a question she'd never asked before, not in all their years together. Mason considered it carefully before answering. Sometimes I miss the challenge of a difficult trail, or the moment when you crest a ridge and see a vista no one else has seen. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his as he had on their wedding day. "But I wouldn't trade what I have now, you, the children, this life we've built together for all the open trails in the world." Her smile in the moonlight was worth more than any treasure. "I love you, Mason Garland, more now than I did 10 years ago, if that's possible." "And I love you, Nathaniel Garland, more with each passing day." As they sat together under the vast Arkansas sky, Mason reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from solitary tracker to husband, father, and rancher. From a man who valued his freedom to roam above all else, to one who had found greater freedom in the bonds of family and love. The trail he'd followed that dawn, tracking kidnappers to rescue a woman he hadn't yet admitted he loved, had led him home. And though the path hadn't always been easy, he wouldn't change a single step, because some trails, once followed, change everything. And some destinations, once reached, make all the wandering worthwhile.